My son-in-law dragged me out onto the fishing dock in a January storm and told me I was too old to smell like salt and dead fish anymore. My daughter wouldn't even look at me. I found something inside that crate Garrett never intended me to see. By sunrise, I understood he'd been planning my disappearance for years. What would you do if the people you sacrificed everything for tried to erase you from your own legacy? My hands were shaking too hard to read past the first line. I made myself read it anyway. A trademark filed under a company that wasn't mine. A licensing deal selling off the one thing that was never supposed to leave our family. The smoking process my great-grandfather brought over from Norway in a tin box. Now packaged up and offered to strangers in Seattle like a recipe off a cereal box. Everything my name used to mean, signed away by someone else's hand. I set the papers down on the workbench, picked them back up. Some part of me kept expecting them to say something different the second time. They didn't. 6 hours earlier, Garrett had helped me carry that same crate out to the truck. "Let me get that Harlan," he'd said, taking the heavy end before I could argue. Grinning the way he always did when he wanted something to look easy. Seriously, 20 years running boats and I still can't lift like you. He'd meant it too, or he'd sounded like he meant it. That was the trouble with Garrett. He always sounded like he meant it. "You taught me more about running a business in 10 years than my own father did in 30. He'd told me not 2 weeks back over coffee, clapping my shoulder like I was still worth something to him. I'd believed him. I'd wanted to believe him. So when he stood in the smokehouse doorway that afternoon and told me to get out, I thought at first I'd misheard him. "Investors are coming Thursday," he'd said, not smiling anymore. "I need this place looking like a business, not a museum for a dead man's hobby." Freya hadn't argued. She'd stood by the salting table with her arms crossed, staring at the floor like it owed her an apology. "It's freezing out there," I'd said to her. "You want your father walking the dock in this?" "There's a room at the Scandia," she'd answered, not to me, to the floor. Garrett already called ahead. I hadn't opened the crate until nearly midnight, alone in Soren's boat shed, my hands too numb from the walk to work the cords at first. I found the papers near the bottom past what I'd assumed was mine. The date on the filing stopped me cold, nearly 2 years old. Not last week, not some panic move once the business started bleeding money, long before Garrett had ever asked me to sign my half of the smokehouse over. "Just for the loan paperwork, Harlan, it's only a formality." Months before that conversation. Before I signed a single page, he'd already decided what he wanted, and he'd already started taking it. Then I saw the second signature under his, and the cold in my hands moved somewhere worse. Freya's name. Her actual handwriting, I'd know it anywhere. The same loop in the capital F she's had since she was 9 years old. Learning cursive at our kitchen table while I smoked the first batch of the season. I sat down hard on an overturned bucket because my legs asked me to, and I didn't have it in me to refuse them. My own daughter. Not tricked into it at the last minute, not rushed into signing something she didn't understand. Her name was there almost 2 years back, right alongside his, on the exact page that erased mine. I thought about every Sunday since then. Every time she'd sat across from me asking about brine ratios like she still wanted to learn the family trade. Every time Garrett had put his hand on my shoulder in front of buyers and called the smokehouse a real Alaska original. None of it had been an accident. None of it had happened by mistake. Out past the shed door, the wind kept working on the harbor, throwing sleet against the tin roof. I didn't feel the cold anymore. A man doesn't build 68 years of a family name on assumptions. He doesn't watch it get taken from him on assumptions either. So I read the date on that filing a third time, just to be sure. And then I sat there in the dark and let myself understand exactly how long they'd both been planning to leave me out of everything we built. Garrett had just been foolish enough to hand me the crate that proved it. I sat with those papers until the shed windows turned gray. And the more I read, the less this looked like a man scrambling to save a failing business. There was a folder underneath the trademark filing I hadn't touched yet. Older correspondence. A licensing proposal draft half finished, dated back further than any of it. I made myself go through every page, the way I'd been trained to 40 years back before I ever gutted a fish for a living. Read once for what's on the page, read again for what someone built the page to hide. What it hid was a timeline. Garrett hadn't started this the week he asked me to sign the loan paperwork. He'd started drafting the licensing language while Elka was still alive. I set that page down slower than the others. Elke used to say the smokehouse only had two owners who ever mattered. My great-grandfather, who built it, and whoever loved it enough to lose sleep over it. She never said Garrett's name when she said that. Once, near the end, she'd ask me straight out if I trusted him with the business the way I'd trusted her with everything else. I'd told her yes, without thinking twice. She hadn't argued. She'd just looked at me a beat too long before she changed the subject. And I understood, now, sitting in that cold shed, that some part of her had already known what I hadn't wanted to. My grandfather lost the family's first smokehouse before I was born, sold out from under him by a partner who filed papers behind his back and called it business sense. My father told it the same way every time, like scripture read at the dinner table. Your grandfather trusted a man's word over a man's paperwork, and paperwork doesn't care what a man promised you out loud. Watch the filings, never let another man hold the pen for what's yours. I'd let Garrett hold the pen for 6 years, and I'd told myself it was because I was tired, not because I'd stopped watching. Near the bottom of the crate, wrapped in a shop rag, was an old phone. Not Garrett's current one, a backup he used to keep in the truck for calls he didn't want on his main line. The screen still lit up when I pressed the button. One saved voicemail unplayed from 3 days back. I shouldn't have listened to it. I did anyway. Garrett, it's Denny. Osaka's still interested, but they want confirmation on the process before anyone signs anything final. Not just the paperwork, the actual method. Brine ratios, smoke times, all of it. They're not paying for a name on a piece of paper. They're paying for the thing itself. Call me back before Thursday. I played it twice. The thing itself. Not the business. Not the building. The method 68 years of knowing exactly how long a fillet needs in the brine before the cold sets in. Wrong exactly how much alder smoke turns a fish bitter instead of good. Nothing I'd ever written down. Nothing that existed anywhere except in my hands and in whatever Freya had bothered to learn from watching me. Garrett didn't have that. He couldn't have that, unless he intended to get it before Thursday. I sat there running through every conversation we'd had in the smokehouse over the past year, trying to remember if I'd ever said too much out loud. Trusting him the way you trust a man you've known long enough to stop watching closely. I couldn't remember. That frightened me more than the voicemail did. Whatever Garrett needed from me, he hadn't gotten it yet. That much I was sure of, because a man who already had what he wanted didn't leave a voicemail like that sitting unanswered in his truck. Denny wanted confirmation before Thursday. Garrett didn't have anything to confirm with. Not without me. Not without either the recipe written down somewhere or me standing in that smokehouse, walking a stranger through it myself. Which meant Thursday wasn't just a deadline. It was a countdown to the one conversation Garrett still needed to have with me, dressed up most likely as something else entirely. A favor, an apology, an invitation back into the smokehouse he'd just thrown me out of. Outside, somebody's truck rolled down toward the harbor. Tire chains grinding against the ice, and for a second, I thought it might be Garrett coming to check on a crate he still believed held nothing but old ledgers and a dead man's tools. It wasn't him. Just a fisherman heading out early, same as any other morning, like the world hadn't tilted sideways sometime after midnight. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, wrapped in the same rag, because a man doesn't hand over what he knows before he's decided what to do with it. Thursday. Whatever Garrett was planning, it needed to happen by Thursday, and it needed more than a piece of paper with my daughter's name on it. It needed the thing itself, and there was only one place on earth he could get that from me. Soren Ass opened his door in a bathrobe at 1 in the morning. Took one look at my face and didn't ask why I was standing on his porch instead of sleeping in the boat shed he'd let me use. "Come in before you freeze to death on my steps, Gamalulf," he said, already turning to put the kettle on. "Whatever this is, it's not going to fix itself out there." We'd known each other 41 years, since he was a young lawyer fresh off the ferry from Juneau, and I was a younger man trying to figure out how to keep a family smokehouse solvent through a bad salmon season. He'd drafted my first supply contract for free because I couldn't afford the fee, and I'd paid him back in smoked king salmon every Christmas since, which he always claimed was the better end of the deal. He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He just made the tea and waited. I set the folder down on his kitchen table. He read the trademark filing first, then the licensing draft, then went back and read the filing date twice, the same way I had. 2 years, he said finally. 2 years. He didn't say anything for a while. Soren had practiced maritime and small business law in Petersburg for 30-some years, long enough to have drafted half the fishing contracts in this town, including 3 separate ones for my own smokehouse over the decades. He knew what he was looking at faster than most men would. You want my honest opinion? Or you want me to be gentle about it? I've had enough gentle today. All right. He set the folder down. Legally, this is bad. Garrett filed this properly. Registered mark, cleared opposition licensing language that would hold up in front of a judge who doesn't know your family from Adam. If this goes to a courtroom as a straight ownership fight, you're an old man claiming a handshake tradition against a filed piece of paper. That's not a fight you win on sentiment. Then I'm not fighting it on sentiment. Soren looked at me over his glasses the way he used to look at difficult clients, back when he still kept an office downtown, instead of running his practice out of a spare bedroom. Then how are you fighting it? I hadn't fully worked that out yet sitting in the dark in that boat shed. I worked it out now, out loud, watching Soren's face for whether it sounded as solid to him as it had started to sound to me. I'm not going to walk into that smokehouse and put a knife to Garrett's throat over this, even if some part of me wants to. That's the version of this where I lose everything I've spent 68 years building along with my daughter, in about the time it takes to say something I can't take back. I want the smokehouse. I want my name back on it. I don't particularly care about destroying Garrett in the process, as long as he doesn't walk away holding what isn't his. That's restraint I wasn't expecting from you tonight. I didn't say I wasn't going to enjoy watching him lose. I said I'm not going to do it with my hands. There was a version of this where I called Freya right now, woke her up, screamed at her the way I'd wanted to since I read her name under his. There was a version where I drove straight to that house and put the papers on the kitchen counter and made both of them look at what they'd done. I'd spent 40 years watching men do exactly that in boardrooms and courtrooms, win the argument and lose everything they were arguing to protect, because they couldn't stand to wait one more day to be right. My grandfather hadn't lost his smokehouse to a bad contract. He'd lost it because he confronted his partner too soon, with no leverage and no proof, and gave the man 3 days' warning to cover his tracks before anyone with authority ever looked at the paperwork. I wasn't going to make the same mistake with a better excuse. Soren almost smiled at that. He got up, refilled both our mugs, and came back with a legal pad, the kind he'd used for 30 years of client meetings, the top page already half full of notes from whatever he'd been working on before I knocked. Trademark opposition has a window, he said, flipping to a clean page. If this registration cleared 8 months ago, the way that attorney's letter says, you may already be close to running out of time to formally challenge it through the normal channel. I'd have to check the exact date it published for opposition. If we're inside the window, we file. If we're not, then what? Then we find another door in. Trade secret law is different from trademark law. A trademark protects a name. A trade secret protects a process, your brine ratios, your smoke times, whatever your great-grandfather actually brought over in that tin box. Think of it this way. Coca-Cola doesn't stop competitors from calling a soft drink cola. What they protect is the formula nobody else can replicate, kept secret on purpose, guarded like it's worth more than the company name itself. If none of your process was ever written down, and Garrett never had lawful access to it beyond what you chose to show him his family, there's an argument that the licensing deal itself is worthless without you standing in that smokehouse. He can own the name on a piece of paper. He can't license what he doesn't actually possess. I thought about that voicemail. The thing itself. Denny in Osaka wasn't paying for a piece of paper. He wanted the method, and the only place that method existed was in my head, and God willing, in whatever Freya had actually managed to hold on to from all those years standing next to me at the salting table. Garrett doesn't have the process, I said slowly. Not really. Not enough to hand it to a stranger. Not yet, apparently. Which tells me he's planning to get it from somewhere before he closes whatever deal this is. I hadn't told Soren about the voicemail yet. I did now, word for word, watching him write Denny's name and the word Osaka on his legal pad, underlining Thursday twice. He sat back when I finished tapping his pen against the table. That changes the timeline, he said. If he needs the actual process before Thursday, and he doesn't currently have lawful access to it, then whatever he's planning next involves getting it out of you one way or another. Which means before we do anything else, I need to know exactly how tight that opposition window actually is. He pulled his laptop over, typed for a while, cross-referencing the filing number against something on the state registry site. I watched his face change somewhere in the middle of it. Not shock, exactly. More like a man noticing a second problem hiding behind the first one he'd already found. What? The LLC listed as applicant, Linkvist Maritime Holdings. He turned the screen toward me. It's not just a shell for the smokehouse deal. Registered address ties it to Garrett's fishing operation, and there's a secondary filing here, a joint holding arrangement with a shipping outfit out of Wrangell. I don't know what that connection means yet, but it's not nothing. And it's not something a man puts together overnight for a trademark filing on a smokehouse. Garrett doesn't own a shipping outfit. He barely keeps his own boats running. He doesn't have to own it. A joint holding arrangement just means somebody agreed to let his name sit next to theirs on paper. Could be nothing. Could mean your son-in-law's troubles run wider than one failing smokehouse deal. Soren jotted the shipping company's name onto the legal pad beneath Denny's. I don't have the resources to chase that thread myself. But I know someone in this town who might already be pulling on it from the other end. Who? A reporter. She's been asking around the harbor for months about the commercial fleets. If there's something rotten connecting Garrett to that shipping company, she may know more about it than either of us does tonight. You think there's more to this than the recipe? Soren closed the laptop slower than he needed to. I think, he said, you came here tonight to ask me how to get your name back on a smokehouse. I think by the time we're done with this, that might turn out to be the smallest thing on the table. The woman who sat down across from me at the Northern Light without asking wasn't from Petersburg. Or if she was, I'd never crossed paths with her in 69 years of living here, which told me something on its own. This town has maybe 3,000 year-round souls. You learn most of the faces by the time you're 40. Mr. Odegaard, Ingrid Voss. She set a leather-bound notebook on the table between us, the cover stitched from something that looked suspiciously like tanned salmon skin. Soren said you might be willing to talk to me. I told him I'd rather ask you myself than have him vouch for me. He didn't mention he was sending anyone. He didn't send me. He gave me your name and said you'd understand why I was asking. That's different. I didn't touch my coffee. 6 hours of sleep in 2 days had left me slower than I liked, and I wanted to be sure of what I was agreeing to before I agreed to anything. You're not from here. Bethel originally. Moved down for the job 4 years ago. She said it like she'd answered the question 100 times and stopped minding it around the 50th. Small papers are the only place left that still lets a reporter chase something for months without a bureau chief asking why it isn't done yet. That's worth something, even at the pay they offer. What exactly are you asking, Ms. Voss? I write for the Petersburg Pilot. Mostly local council meetings and school board budgets, the kind of thing that pays the bills and puts nobody to sleep faster. She almost smiled at her own joke, then didn't. For the last 4 months, I've been looking into something else. Commercial fishing operations pulling more than their permitted catch outside designated zones. It's not glamorous. It's the kind of story that takes a year to prove and gets read by maybe 600 people when it finally runs. And you think my son-in-law is part of it? I think Garrett Lindqvist's operation shows up in satellite tracking data outside his permitted zone on 4 separate nights over the past 6 months, each time for several hours each time, with his transponder either switched off or reporting a location that doesn't match the vessel's actual position. She opened the notebook, turned it toward me. Printed pages, gridded coordinates, dates circled in red pen. That's not a mistake a man makes once. That's a pattern. I looked at the dates. One of them I remembered without trying was 2 nights before Elka's memorial service last spring. Garrett had told us all he was working late on a listing. Where does the shipping company come in? Soren mentioned Wrangle. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly. More like a woman recalculating how much of her hand she was willing to show a stranger she'd met 4 minutes ago. The vessel he's been taking out illegally isn't licensed under his own name. It's registered to a joint holding company he shares with a shipping outfit in Wrangle. On paper, that arrangement looks like an ordinary business partnership. In practice, it means if state fisheries enforcement ever traces the illegal catch back to that boat, the ownership trail runs cold in about 90 seconds because nobody can prove which partner was actually on the water that night. You think he set it up that way on purpose? I think a man doesn't accidentally structure his fishing operation to be legally untraceable. Somebody with more sophistication than a small-town real estate deal explains helped him build that arrangement. And I've been trying for 4 months to figure out why a man running a modestly successful boat operation would need that kind of cover. I thought about the voicemail. The trademark filing. 2 years of quiet planning that had nothing to do with any single crisis, and everything to do with a man building exits before anyone knew he'd need one. He's in debt, I said. More than any of us realized. I found paperwork 3 days ago showing he's been trying to license my family's smoking process to a buyer in Osaka. Not the business, the actual method. Something that was never supposed to leave the family. Ingrid went very still, the way a person goes still when a piece they'd been missing drops into a puzzle they'd already half assembled without it. Osaka, she repeated. Do you have a name? Denny. A broker, I think, calling from a number Garrett kept on a separate phone. She wrote it down without looking up. If Garrett's illegally fishing to cover losses and simultaneously trying to license or sell off intellectual property that isn't legally his to sell, that's not a man solving one problem, that's a man drowning on multiple fronts at once, grabbing at whatever he can reach. What happens if you publish what you have? Right now, not enough. I have tracking anomalies and a joint holding structure that looks suspicious but isn't illegal by itself. I need documentation connecting the boat's actual catch numbers to what he's reporting to the state, or a witness willing to go on record, or both. Without that, I run a story that says, something looks strange here, and Garrett's lawyer buries it in a week. And if I can get you documentation— She was quiet for a moment, studying me the way I imagined she studied every source before deciding whether to trust them with the parts of a story that could still fall apart. I should tell you something before we go further, Mr. Odegaard. If you help me on this and it becomes public, you won't just be a father exposing a bad son-in-law. You'll be a named source in a fraud investigation involving your own daughter's husband. People in this town already know your family. Some of them will decide you did the right thing. Others will decide you tore your family apart over money and a name on a building. I can't control which version they choose to believe, and neither can you. I've already lost the version of my family where none of that matters, I said. I'd rather lose the rest of it to the truth than to him. She closed the notebook finally and looked at me the way Soren had looked at me the night before, like a person deciding how much weight an old man could actually carry before offering to share the load. Then I think you and I might be looking for the same thing, Mr. Odegaard, from 2 different doors. I want the fishing violations. You want your name back on a smokehouse. But if everything you're telling me is true, both of those doors might open onto the same room. What room is that? A man who's been quietly taking things that weren't his for at least 2 years, counting on nobody putting the pieces together before he could disappear with all of it. She slid a card across the table. Her name, a phone number, nothing else printed on it. Call me when you have something. Or don't, if this is too much to ask of a man who buried his wife 3 years ago and got thrown out of his own business 2 days ago. I won't hold it against you either way. I picked up the card, held it a moment longer than I needed to. You said 4 nights over 6 months, I said. When's the next one likely to happen? She looked at me for a long second before she answered, like she was only now deciding I might be more useful to her than she'd expected. Based on the pattern sometime in the next week, probably tied to whatever deadline is forcing his hand right now. She stood, pulling her coat tighter against the wind coming through the door every time it opened. You mentioned Thursday, didn't you, Mr. Odegaard? I hadn't told her about Thursday. I'd only told Soren. Small town, she said, reading my face correctly. Soren and I talk more than either of us probably should. If Thursday means what I think it means, you and I don't have much time to decide how much we're willing to trust each other. I heard the truck before I saw it. Too fast for Soren's gravel drive tires, skidding slightly on the patch of ice by the mailbox. I was at the kitchen table when the engine cut off, and through the window, I watched my daughter sit behind the wheel for a full 10 seconds before she made herself get out. I'd spent 3 days rehearsing what I might say to her the next time we were in the same room, and every version had dissolved the moment I actually saw her face through the frosted glass, pale and unsteady. Nothing like the woman who'd stood by the salting table with her arms crossed. Soren looked up from his laptop. You expecting her? No. He closed the screen anyway, the way a man does when he senses a conversation is about to happen that doesn't need an audience. But he didn't leave the room. He just moved to the far end of the table and made himself smaller, close enough to hear, far enough to pretend he wasn't listening. I didn't ask him to leave. Some part of me wanted a witness to whatever was about to happen, someone who could tell me later that I hadn't imagined it, or hadn't overreacted, or hadn't been too hard on my own daughter when she needed something gentler than what I had left to give her. Freya knocked twice hard before I reached the door. When I opened it, she was already crying, though not the practiced kind I might have expected after everything I'd learned in the last 3 days. This looked like something that had been building since long before she got in the truck. Can I come in? I stepped aside. She walked past me into Soren's front room, wrapping her coat tighter around herself even though the house was warm, and stood there for a moment, like she'd forgotten why she'd driven over. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth because I don't think Garrett has been. I've never lied to you in your life, Freya. I know. Her voice cracked on the word. That's why I'm here instead of at home. She sat down at the table across from me, and for a moment I saw the girl who used to sit in that exact posture at our own kitchen table, homework spread out, chewing the end of her pencil while she waited for me to check her long division before dinner. Elke used to say, Freya inherited my patience for detail and her own capacity for guilt, and that the two together would either make her formidable or make her miserable, depending on who she married. I hadn't understood what Elke meant until just now. Watching my grown daughter sit in a stranger's kitchen with her hands shaking, trying to work out how much of the last 2 years she was actually responsible for. It was hard to reconcile that girl with the woman who'd stood in the salting table doorway 3 days ago and let her husband throw me out into a storm without saying a word in my defense. There's paperwork, she said, from 2 years ago. Garrett had me sign something about restructuring the business. He said it was for the loan for tax purposes, something about protecting the smokehouse from creditors if his boat operation ever went under. I didn't read it carefully. I trusted him. I trusted both of you to have my best interests at heart, and I signed a stack of papers at our kitchen table on a Tuesday night, without reading past the first page, because that's what you do when you're married to someone, and you're tired, and you have a 2-year-old asleep upstairs, and you just want to go to bed. I said nothing. I let her keep talking because I'd learned enough in my working life to know that silence pulls more truth out of a person than any question does. I found something on his laptop last night, she continued. An email thread with an attorney about a trademark, about licensing something to a company overseas. I didn't understand half of what it said, but I understood enough to know it wasn't about the loan he told me it was about. It's not, I said quietly. It never was. I reached into the folder I'd brought with me, the copy I'd made at Soren's. Not the original, which was locked in a safe deposit box downtown by then, and slid the trademark filing across the table. She read it the way I had. Slowly, then faster, then slower again, going back to check something she didn't believe she'd read correctly the first time. Lindqvist Maritime Holdings, she whispered, This isn't the loan paperwork. No. This is... She stopped, started again. This says the smoking process, the recipe. He's trying to sell the recipe. He's trying to sell everything, Freya. The name, the process, whatever he can get a price for before whatever debt he's carrying catches up with him. I don't fully understand the scope of it yet, but I understand enough to know it started 2 years ago, not 2 weeks ago, and I understand that your signature is on the page authorizing it. Her hand went to the paper to the line where her name sat beneath Garrett's, and I watched her go the same particular shade of pale I'd gone in Soren's boat shed 3 nights before. I signed this. You did. I didn't read it. I believe you. Dad, I need you to believe me, because if you think for 1 second that I knew what this actually said, that I sat at our kitchen table and signed away your family's business on purpose, I don't think that. I said it as gently as I could manage, which wasn't very gently, because I hadn't fully decided yet how much of my anger belonged to her and how much belonged to the man who'd handed her the pen. I think you signed what your husband put in front of you because you trusted him. I think that's exactly the problem, Freya. Not that you're a bad daughter, that you married a man who understood you'd sign anything he told you was routine, and he built 2 years of quiet theft on exactly that trust. You're angry at me anyway. I can hear it. I'm angry, Freya. I'm not sure yet how much of it is at you and how much of it is at myself for not teaching you to read everything twice before you sign it, the way my own father taught me. I spent your whole childhood telling you stories about your great-grandfather losing everything to a man he trusted too much. And somehow I never once thought to ask whether you were listening or whether you'd recognize the same mistake happening in your own kitchen 30 years later. That's not fair. You can't blame yourself for what he did. I'm not blaming myself for what he did. I'm asking myself why I didn't see it coming sooner in either one of you. She flinched at that, and I regretted the shape of it even as I said it, though not enough to take it back. She was shaking now, properly shaking, her hands pressed flat against the tabletop, like she was trying to hold herself in one piece through sheer physical pressure. There's something else, she said so quietly I almost missed it over the sound of Soren's kettle starting to whistle in the kitchen. Something I should have told you 3 days ago, when he first started pushing to sell the house. I didn't because I told myself it wasn't important. I'm starting to think I told myself a lot of things weren't important. I didn't say anything. I just waited the way I had with Soren, the way 40 years of reading other men's silences had taught me to wait. What is it, Freya? She opened her mouth to answer and then didn't. Not yet. She looked down at the paper at her own signature, staring back up at her, and I watched something in her face collapse under the weight of a decision she hadn't finished making. It wasn't just that one signature, Freya said. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at her own hands flat against the table, like she needed to watch them stay still to keep the rest of herself from coming apart. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up again, rattling the loose gutter along the edge of Soren's roof. The same sound it had made 3 nights ago, while I sat alone in the boat shed, reading my own name off a piece of paper that no longer had it on there. There were other nights, other papers. Not always trademark filings. I didn't understand what half of it was, honestly, I still don't. But there were nights he'd come home late from the boat, smelling like diesel instead of fish, and he'd sit at the computer until 2 in the morning. And if I asked what he was working on, he'd say, "Numbers, just numbers, don't worry about it." And I didn't worry about it. I told myself that was normal, that's what running a business looks like. Freya, let me finish. Please. Her voice had gone thin, stretched tight over something that wanted to break. About 8 months ago, I found a folder on the shared drive labeled Osaka Correspondence. I opened it. I read maybe 2 lines before I closed it again because I didn't understand the language. Licensing terms, proprietary process valuation things that meant nothing to me. And instead of asking him what it meant, I closed the folder and never mentioned it. Not to him, not to you. I told myself it was probably nothing, some deal he was working that hadn't panned out yet. Not worth bringing up and starting a fight over. I felt something in my chest go very still. The particular stillness that comes right before a man understands he's about to hear the worst version of something he'd already half suspected. 8 months ago, I said. 8 months ago. You knew there was an Osaka deal 8 months ago and you said nothing. Not when he pushed to sell the house. Not when he threw me out 3 days ago. Not once in 8 months did it occur to you to ask your husband why a folder on your shared computer had my family's business connected to a word like proprietary process valuation. I know how it sounds. I don't think you do, Freya. I don't think you understand yet how it sounds, because if you did, you wouldn't still be sitting there, waiting for me to tell you it's all right. She flinched, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Soren's kettle had gone quiet in the kitchen. I hadn't noticed him get up to take it off the burner. I hadn't noticed the particular kindness of him giving us that much privacy inside a house that wasn't big enough for real privacy at all. I was scared, Freya finally said. And this time when she looked up, her eyes were red in a way that had nothing to do with performance. I was scared that if I asked him directly what that folder meant, he'd tell me the truth, and I wasn't ready to hear that the man I married might be exactly the kind of man you always warned me about. So I did the thing that was easier. I closed the folder, and I told myself I trusted him, because trusting him meant I didn't have to find out what would happen if I stopped. Something in me wanted to reach across that table and pull my daughter into my arms the way I had when she was small enough to carry, when a scraped knee or a bad dream was the worst thing either of us had to survive. I wanted it badly enough that my hand actually moved an inch toward hers before I stopped it. I didn't trust the impulse. That was the truth of it, sitting there watching her cry. I had spent 69 years being the man who forgave too quickly, who handed people the benefit of the doubt before they'd earned an ounce of it, who'd built an entire life around the belief that love meant giving without keeping score. That belief was exactly what Garrett had built his 2-year plan on top of. If I softened now in this kitchen, before I understood the full shape of what my own daughter had chosen not to see, I was afraid I'd be doing the same thing I'd always done. Forgiving first and asking questions never. Mistaking the relief of reconciliation for the much harder work of actually understanding what had happened. Elka would have known what to do with her hands in this moment. She always did. She had a way of holding someone accountable and holding them close at the same time, as if the two things had never once seemed contradictory to her. And I'd married her partly because I never learned that particular trick myself. My instinct only ever ran in one direction at a time: forgive completely or hold back completely. And sitting across from my daughter's shaking hands, I understood for the first time in 3 days exactly how much that single failing of mine had cost this family already. So I didn't reach for her hand. I reached for the paper instead, the trademark filing still lying open between us, and I folded it closed along its original crease. Slow and deliberate, giving my hands something to do besides what they wanted to do. I need you to hear me say this clearly, I told her, because I don't think I'll say it as clearly again. I don't think you conspired against me, Freya. I think you looked away from something you were afraid to see, and looking away isn't the same crime as building the theft yourself. But it isn't nothing either. 8 months of not asking a question is 8 months where you could have stopped this and you didn't. And I need you to sit with that before either of us decides what happens next between us. So what happens next? I don't know yet. I know I'm not ready to forgive you the way I've forgiven everyone who ever asked me to. Quick and total and without conditions, because that's exactly the habit that got me thrown out into a snowstorm 3 days ago with a crate I wasn't supposed to open. I set the folded paper down on the table between us, a small, deliberate distance from her hand. What I know is that you came here and told me the truth before I found it out some other way. That matters. It's not everything, but it matters. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, like she was 12 years old again. What do we do about Thursday? She asked finally. I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her, past the guilt and the fear, and the 8 months of a closed folder sitting between us like a wall neither of us had built on purpose. And I felt the shape of my own plan shift slightly to make room for a version of it I hadn't considered before tonight. That depends on whether you're ready to help me find out exactly how deep this goes, I said. Not for my sake, for yours. You have more to lose in this than I do, Freya, And it's time you understood that before Garrett decides how much of it he's willing to let you lose on his behalf. What would that even look like? Me helping? I don't fully know yet. But you're still in that house with him. You see his phone, his calendar, whatever paperwork he leaves lying around when he thinks nobody's paying attention. I'm not asking you to spy on your husband, Freya. I'm asking you to finally start paying the kind of attention you should have been paying 8 months ago, and to bring what you learned to me instead of burying it in a folder you never open again. She was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. And if what I find makes it worse, for him, I mean, if it's enough to put him away, then you'll have to decide what you actually owe him versus what you owe yourself, and what you owe the people he's already stolen from without either of us knowing their names yet. I stood, finally my knees protesting the hours I'd spent sitting in that chair. I can't make that decision easier for you. I can only tell you that the version of you who closes the folder and says nothing has already cost this family more than either of us can afford to lose twice. Soren met me at the smokehouse itself the next morning, which surprised me. I'd assumed we'd keep working out of his kitchen, safely removed from anywhere Garrett might think to look. But Soren had a different idea. If we're building a trade secret claim, he said, standing in the cold doorway with his collar turned up against the wind, I need to see the thing we're claiming secrecy over, not describe it, see it. A judge is going to ask what measures your family actually took to keep this process confidential, and we never wrote it down, only gets us halfway to an answer. Garrett hadn't changed the locks yet either. An oversight or a small cruelty leaving the door open so I could feel exactly how much I'd already lost by walking through it uninvited. The smell hit me the way it always did. Brine and alder smoke soaked so deep into the walls that no amount of ventilation would ever fully clear it. 68 years of it, layered into the wood like rings in a tree. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to, letting it settle over me, because some part of me still expected to hear Elka's voice calling from the back room, asking whether I'd remembered to check the second smoker. And some part of me still hadn't fully accepted that I wouldn't. The investor's signage was already up, a glossy banner Garrett must have ordered weeks ago. Lindqvist Maritime stretched across a wall that had held nothing but a faded family crest for as long as I'd been alive. I made myself look away from it before it did something to my resolve I didn't have time for. Soren noticed me looking and said nothing, which I appreciated more than I could have told him. Where do we start? Soren asked. The back office. There's a filing cabinet my grandfather built before I was born. Nobody's touched half of what's in it since he died. The cabinet was exactly where I remembered it. Wedged behind a shelf of curing salts Garrett had apparently decided wasn't worth clearing out for his investors. The bottom drawer stuck the way it always had, and I had to put my shoulder into it before it gave. Inside, wrapped in a square of oiled canvas, was a notebook I hadn't looked at in probably 20 years. My grandfather's handwriting, faded but legible, dated across the front, in a hand that still carried the shape of the Norwegian alphabet, even though he'd written it in English. The canvas had gone stiff with age, and I had to work it loose with my thumbnail before the notebook came free. Dust rising off it into the gray light coming through the window. Soren took it carefully, the way a man handles something he already suspects is worth more than it looks. 1941, he read off the inside cover. This is contemporaneous with the business itself. He started keeping it the year he opened. Mostly weather notes, catch counts. But there's process detail scattered through it, too. Not the full method, he was too careful for that. But enough to show the shape of it. Enough to prove the family was already doing this exact thing in this exact building 4 generations before anybody in Osaka ever heard the word Odegaard. Soren paged through it slowly, and I watched something shift in his expression. The look of a lawyer realizing a case he'd assumed would be difficult had just gotten meaningfully easier. This is what we needed, he said. Trade secret law doesn't just ask whether something was valuable and kept confidential. It asks whether you took reasonable measures to protect it. A licensing scheme like Garrett's collapses fast if we can show a documented, continuous history of a process the family deliberately never wrote down in full, never shared outside blood relation, and guarded specifically because writing it down would have made it stealable. This notebook doesn't give away the recipe. It proves the recipe existed and that your family understood exactly how much it was worth protecting decades before Garrett Lindqvist knew what a smokehouse was. I turned to a page near the middle, my grandfather's hand. Steadier there, ink darker, like he'd pressed harder writing it. Brine holds 4 days this batch. Too long by half a day per father's rule. But the cold came late this year, and I judged it by feel rather than the clock. Told no one the adjustment. Some things a man keeps in his hands and nowhere else. I read it twice. Some things a man keeps in his hands and nowhere else. My grandfather had understood writing those words in 1941 exactly what Garrett would eventually try to take. Not the business, not even really the name, but the specific, unrepeatable trust of a family, passing something down hand to hand instead of paper to paper. There's more, Soren said, still turning pages. Look at this. Entries every season, same handwriting until... He flipped forward several pages, the ink changing, a different hand picking up the thread. This isn't your grandfather's writing anymore. That would be my father. He kept it going after. And after him. I hadn't looked that far in years. I took the notebook from Soren and turned toward the back, past decades I'd half forgotten existed on paper, until the handwriting changed again, into something I recognized instantly because I'd been looking at it my whole adult life, in birthday cards and grocery lists, and more recently on the bottom of a trademark filing that had erased my name from everything it touched. My own handwriting. Younger, sloppier, but unmistakably mine from decades back when I'd first taken over the books. And then further still, one final entry in a hand neither of us expected to find there at all. Freya's handwriting. 16 years old, judging by the date, a single entry from a season she'd spent working summers in the smokehouse before she'd left for college. 3 lines about a batch that had run long, signed with her initials the way she'd seen her father and grandfather sign theirs before her. Soren looked at the page for a long moment, then at me. She's in this notebook too, he said quietly. Before any of this happened, before Garrett, this isn't just your legacy, Harlan. Legally speaking, it might be a stronger claim that either of us realized walking in here this morning. Because whatever Garrett's planning to sell, your daughter's own handwriting proves the family passed this process down through her hands as well as yours, years before he ever put a pen to that trademark filing. I thought about calling Freya right then, telling her what we'd found, but something told me it could wait until this was further along. She had her own part to play in this now, watching and waiting inside a house I couldn't safely enter, and I didn't want to hand her one more piece of evidence that might show on her face at the wrong moment, in front of the wrong person. There's a statute question too, Soren added, flipping back to the front of the notebook. How long you have to file an opposition, and separately, how long you have to bring a misappropriation claim once you can prove you knew about the theft. Both clocks started running the moment you opened that crate 3 nights ago. I don't want to alarm you, but we don't have the luxury of taking our time deciding how we use this. I'm not interested in taking my time, I said. I've done nothing but wait patiently for things to resolve themselves for the better part of 3 years, ever since Elka passed. I'm done waiting. I closed the notebook carefully, the way my grandfather must have closed it 1,000 times across 4 decades, and set it down on the desk between us like it was something that might still bruise if handled wrong. Then we file the opposition, I said. Quietly. Before Thursday, and we make sure Garrett doesn't find out what's sitting in this building until it's already too late for him to do anything about it. We were 3 drawers deep into the filing cabinet, past ledgers and tax records nobody but Soren cared about, when I found the folder with Garrett's father's name on it. The morning had turned into afternoon somewhere in the middle of it, the light through the smokehouse window shifting from gray to grayer, and my back had started complaining about the hours spent crouched over a drawer built for a shorter man than I'd grown into. I almost skipped past it. It was old, water-stained at one corner, tucked behind a stack of receipts, from a supplier that had gone out of business before Freya was even born. But the name on the tab stopped me. Lindqvist R. And something about seeing that surname sitting in my grandfather's filing system decades before Freya ever married into the family made my hands slow down. What is it? Soren asked, looking up from the stack of old permits he'd been sorting through, on the floor beside me. I don't know yet. Inside was a short correspondence, 4 letters total, dated across a span of 8 months, sometime in the early 90s. My father's handwriting on one side, a man named Roald Lindqvist's on the other. I read the first letter twice before I understood what I was looking at. Garrett's father, I said. Roald. He ran a smoked fish operation up near Wrangell back before Garrett was old enough to remember much of it. My father corresponded with him about supplier contacts, apparently, back when they were both trying to keep small operations alive against the same canneries. That's not unusual for the industry, is it, small operators talking shop? No. But look at this one. I handed him the third letter, dated 11 months after the first. Roald's handwriting had changed by then. Smaller, tighter. The writing of a man conserving paper because he'd started conserving everything. My partner filed papers behind my back 3 weeks ago, Roald had written. Registered the operating name under his own holding company while I was recovering from my father's funeral, told me it was a formality to secure a loan. By the time I understood what he'd done, the bank already recognized him as sole owner of record. I have no recourse. I wanted you to know Harlan's father because you always dealt with me straight, and there are few enough men left in this business who do. I set the letter down slowly. Garrett's father lost his own business the exact same way, I said. Partner forged the paperwork, buried it in loan documents, and by the time Roald understood what happened, it was already too late to fight. Soren was quiet for a moment, reading it over my shoulder. That's not a coincidence a jury's going to love hearing about, he said finally. Either Garrett learned this playbook from watching his own father get destroyed by it, or he grew up believing that's just how business works. That's just what men do to each other when the stakes get high enough. I felt something twist in my chest that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite disgust, some uncomfortable third thing sitting between them. Doesn't excuse what he's done, but it explains where he might have learned to do it so cleanly. There was a fourth letter in the folder, shorter than the others, dated almost a year after the last one. My father had written it, not Roald. A brief, careful note, checking in on a man he'd apparently lost touch with after the business collapsed. There was no response filed behind it. Whether Roald never wrote back or whether the response simply hadn't survived 4 decades in a drawer, I had no way of knowing. I thought about a boy somewhere in Wrangell watching his father lose everything to a man he'd trusted, learning whatever lesson a child learns from watching that happen at close range. I didn't excuse it. But for the first time since I'd opened that crate 3 nights ago, some small, unwelcome part of me understood Garrett a little better than I wanted to. Soren set the folder aside and reached for a box of photographs on the shelf above the cabinet. The kind of box every family accumulates and nobody ever properly sorts. While we're in here, did Garrett spend much time in this building before all this started? Casually, I mean, not business? Some. He'd come around when Freya brought Niels by, let the boy watch me work the smoker. I pulled out a handful of photographs, mostly recent, mostly of my grandson standing on a step stool at the salting table, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. There's a whole afternoon last spring where Niels wanted to learn the brine mix. I let him help stir it, even though at 4 years old he mostly just splashed it everywhere. I flipped to a photograph from that day. Niels standing at the table, my hands guiding his over the brine bucket. And behind us, slightly out of focus, Garrett standing in the doorway with his phone raised. I'd assumed at the time he was taking a picture of his son. Soren leaned in closer, studying the photograph, then pulled out his own phone and enlarged something on it. A text thread I hadn't seen yet, forwarded from Ingrid that morning, while I'd been distracted by the notebook. Ingrid sent this an hour ago, he said. She's been digging through whatever public-facing cloud storage Garrett's fishing operation uses for its business files, looking for anything connecting the illegal catches to his financial records. She found something else instead. He turned the screen toward me. A file. Uploaded 11 months ago. Filed in Norwegian, badly transliterated. Best translation is something close to family recipe final.mp3. The photograph was still in my other hand. Garrett, in the doorway phone, raised, angled, not at his son's face, but down toward the table, toward my hands, moving over the brine. Not a photograph at all. He wasn't taking a picture that day, I said, and heard my own voice come out flatter than I expected. Flatter than the moment probably deserved. He was recording. Soren didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at the photograph again. Niels laughing, my hands guiding his, and Garrett standing behind us, with his phone held low and steady. Exactly the angle a man uses when he doesn't want anyone to notice what he's actually filming. I thought about that afternoon, the way I remembered it before this moment. The good kind of ordinary. Nils's small hands slick with brine. His delighted shriek when a splash caught him in the face. Garrett laughing along from the doorway, like any proud father watching his son learn something from his grandfather. I had told Freya that night it was one of the better days I'd had since Elka passed. I had meant it. Some part of that afternoon had felt briefly like proof that the family might actually hold together the way it was supposed to. 11 months. He'd had it for 11 months, sitting quietly on a server somewhere, waiting for the right buyer and the right price, while I taught my grandson to stir brine in the same bucket my own father had used, believing every second of it was nothing but a good afternoon between a man and his family. I closed the photo box without looking through the rest of it. I didn't trust myself to keep looking, not yet, not with Soren standing there, watching my face for whatever it might give away. There were things I could say out loud about the trademark filing, about the years of quiet planning, about the folder with Roald Lindqvist's name on it. This wasn't one of them. I set the box back on the shelf and pressed the lid down until it clicked harder than the lid actually required, and said nothing at all about why my hands weren't quite steady doing it. He doesn't need Thursday to hand Denny anything, I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. He already has it. Whatever we're planning, we're not racing to stop him from getting the process. We're racing to stop him from finishing what he already started 11 months ago. The phone rang at 11:40 at night, and I knew before I answered it that whoever was calling wasn't calling with good news. Nobody calls an old man that late for anything else. I'd been lying awake in Soren's guest room anyway, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had probably been there since before I was born. Running through the trademark filing and the notebook and the recording in my head, the way a man turns over a puzzle he can't quite make fit together. So the first ring caught me with my eyes already open. "It's Ingrid," she said before I'd even finished saying hello. "I need you to listen carefully because I don't have long and there's a lot to cover." I sat up in the unfamiliar bed, reaching for the lamp. Down the hall, I heard Soren's bedroom door open, his footsteps in the hallway. He'd heard the phone too, at his age. Sleep came thin enough that anything past 10 o'clock registered as an emergency worth investigating. "Go ahead. Freya called me an hour ago. She's been doing exactly what you asked, paying attention the way she said she would. Tonight she found bank correspondence in Garrett's home office. Notice of default proceedings initiated 3 weeks ago on a business loan against the fishing operation. He's not just behind. He's about to lose the boats outright unless he produces a significant payment within the week. How significant? Enough that selling the smokehouse trademark and licensing the process to Osaka wouldn't just be profitable for him. It would be the only thing standing between him and losing the entire operation. The boats, the permits, everything his father's name was ever attached to in this industry. Freya thinks that's part of why he's pushing so hard. It's not just greed at this point. He's drowning, and the smokehouse deal is the only line he's got left to grab. Soren had made his way into the doorway of the guest room by then, wrapped in a robe, listening with his arms crossed. I put the call on speaker so he wouldn't have to piece it together secondhand. "Ask her how Freya found it without him noticing," Soren said quietly. I relayed the question. Ingrid's voice came back a little tighter. She said he keeps a physical folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked, but she found the spare key years ago and never told him she knew where it was. She's been going through it every night this week after he falls asleep. She sounded frightened, Harlan. More frightened than I expected from someone who agreed to this 3 days ago. I think the reality of what she's finding is starting to outpace what she thought she was signing up for. I thought about a boy somewhere in Wrangell, and a folder with Roald Lindqvist's careful handwriting in it, and understood with an uncomfortable clarity that I was watching a version of the same story play out twice in one family. One generation removed. A spouse discovering too late exactly how much had been kept from them in a drawer they weren't supposed to open. She's not backing out, is she? No. But she asked me to tell you she's scared and that she needed someone besides Garrett to know that tonight. I sat with that for a moment before I answered. Tell her I heard her. Tell her I'm proud of her for looking in that drawer, even though it terrified her, and that fear doesn't cancel out what she's doing. It's part of what makes it matter. There's more, Ingrid continued. Freya also found something on his calendar. There's an event Thursday evening at the Sons of Norway Hall downtown, a private reception, invitation only, framed publicly as a heritage products showcase for local investors, but the guest list includes a name I recognize. Kenji Tanaka, listed as a representative for a distribution company based in Osaka. Denny's buyer. Has to be. Which means Thursday isn't just a deadline for closing a paper deal. It's the actual event where Garrett intends to demonstrate the process, show the investors and Tanaka's people exactly what they're buying, probably using the recording he already has, and finalize the licensing agreement on the spot, in front of witnesses who'll make it very hard to unwind afterward. I felt the shape of the whole thing solidify in my chest, cold and clear. The way numbers used to solidify for me 40 years ago, when a spreadsheet finally stopped hiding what it had been hiding all along. That's not all, Ingrid said, and something in her voice shifted the careful, measured tone of a reporter, giving me information she suspected I wouldn't want. The satellite tracking I've been monitoring flagged an alert 20 minutes ago. Garrett's vessel just left the harbor. Transponders dark again, same pattern as the previous 4 incidents. Tonight. He's out there right now. Right now. Based on the previous runs, he'll likely be back before dawn catch offloaded somewhere. It won't show up on any official manifest. I think he's trying to squeeze one more illegal haul out before Thursday, liquidate it fast for cash to cover part of that loan, default buy himself just enough room to survive until the licensing deal closes. I stood, up my knees protesting the sudden movement, and started pulling on the clothes I'd left folded over the guest room chair. What are you doing? Ingrid asked, hearing the rustling through the phone. I want to see it. Not to stop him, I understand. I can't do that alone. And I wouldn't know how to safely intervene on open water even if I could. But I want documentation. Photographs, timestamps, anything that puts his boat exactly where it shouldn't be on the exact night we can prove financial desperation was driving him to it. I can have that faster than you can get down to the harbor in the middle of the night, Harlan. I've had a contact watching the coordinates for months. What I need from you isn't photographs, it's a decision. About what? About how we use everything we're both sitting on. Right now, I have illegal fishing patterns, a joint holding structure designed to obscure liability, and a default notice that gives him motive. You have a trademark filing that predates any of his current desperation, a notebook proving decades of guarded family process, and evidence he secretly recorded that process 11 months ago. Separately, both of our stories are damaging, together on the same night, in front of the exact buyer he's trying to close a deal with that's not damaging. That's the end of him. Soren sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face. She's not wrong. If you file the opposition quietly next week, and Ingrid publishes her story separately next month, Garrett has time between the two to lawyer up, spin a narrative, maybe even settle with Tanaka's people before either action fully lands. Combined in the same room with no warning, he doesn't get that runway. That's exactly it, Ingrid said, apparently hearing Soren clearly enough through the phone. I don't publish anything before Thursday. You don't file anything before Thursday. We let him believe right up until the moment he's standing in that hall with Tanaka watching that everything is proceeding exactly the way he's planned it for 2 years. And then we take it all away from him at once, in front of the only people whose good opinion he still needs. I stood in the dark guest room, phone pressed to my ear, and understood for the first time exactly how close we'd come to running out of time to decide anything at all. Thursday, I said. Thursday, Ingrid agreed. Whatever we're going to do, Harlan, we do it there, in that room, in front of everyone he's trying to impress. Anything smaller than that, and he finds a way to survive it. I don't think either of us wants to give him that chance twice. Soren was already reaching for a legal pad from the nightstand, the same habit he'd carried into a stranger's guest room at midnight that he carried everywhere else. Then we have 2 days to build the entire case, coordinate 3 separate threads of evidence, and make sure nothing leaks before Thursday evening. That's not much runway. It's what we have, I said. It'll have to be enough. 2 days is not a long time to build a case that ends a man's life as he currently understands it. But it turned out to be exactly the amount of time we had, and Soren, Ingrid, and I spent every waking hour of it making sure none of it went to waste. Soren filed the trade secret opposition Wednesday morning, quietly, through channels that wouldn't alert Garrett's attorney until the filing had already cleared initial review. He called me at noon with the confirmation, his voice carrying a satisfaction I hadn't heard from him since the night I first showed up on his porch. "It's in," he said. "Provisionally accepted pending review, which means, as of this morning, Garrett's licensing agreement with Osaka is sitting on legally contested ground, whether he knows it yet or not. If Tanaka's people do even minimal due diligence before Thursday night, they'll find the filing. I'm guessing they won't. Men moving fast on a deal this size rarely slow down to double-check paperwork nobody's told them to worry about. And if they don't find it themselves, then we make sure it's the first thing they hear about in the room before anyone signs anything." He'd spent Tuesday night, he told me, drafting 3 different versions of how that moment might unfold. One where he handed Tanaka's people the opposition filing directly. One where he interrupted Garrett's pitch at the precise moment the process was demonstrated. And one, his preferred version, where he said almost nothing and let the paperwork speak for itself in front of witnesses who would understand instantly what it meant. "Lawyers talk too much when they're nervous," he told me. "I'd rather Garrett fill that silence himself trying to explain something that doesn't have an explanation." Ingrid, for her part, had spent the 2 days finishing what she called the spine of her story. Every satellite coordinate, every default notice, every joint holding filing laid out in a document she'd shown me on her laptop screen the previous evening. More thorough than anything I'd expected from a woman who covered school board budgets for a living. She wasn't publishing yet. She was building the exact shape of what she'd publish the moment Thursday's reception ended, timed so precisely that Garrett would have no window at all between the confrontation and the story breaking. "I want him walking out of that hall into a world that already knows everything," she told me over the phone Wednesday night. "Not a world where he has 48 hours to call a lawyer and get ahead of it." I spent my own 2 days doing something considerably less strategic. I went back to my own house. The house I still technically half-owned, though nobody living in it seemed to remember that anymore. While Garrett was out on the boat, and Freya was at the grocery store, and I stood in the closet I'd shared with Elka for 31 years, looking for the one thing I actually needed. It was hanging exactly where I'd left it. A charcoal suit, tailored decades ago for my father's retirement dinner, and taken in twice since, as my own frame had changed with age. The kind of suit I hadn't worn since Elka's memorial service. She'd picked it out originally, actually, insisting a man ought to own at least one good suit that wasn't for funerals. And I'd told her at the time I couldn't imagine what other occasion would ever call for it. "You'll know when the moment comes," she'd said. The way she said most things with more certainty about my own future than I usually had myself. She'd been right about nearly everything in our 31 years together, right apparently about a suit I'd have no use for until 3 years after she was gone, and I needed to stand in a room full of strangers and prove I was still a man worth taking seriously. I understood now, standing in that closet 3 years later, that she'd been right to make me buy it, even if neither of us could have guessed what it would eventually be for. I ran my hand down the sleeve before I took it off the hanger, half expecting to still catch some trace of her on the fabric, though of course there was nothing left after 3 years but wool and memory. I took it back to Soren's house, folded carefully over my arm, along with a tie I remembered her choosing to match it. Deep blue, the color of the water off the harbor on a clear morning. I hung both in the guest room closet and didn't try them on yet. There was something about wearing them too early that felt like tempting fate, like a man measuring himself for a coffin before he was sure he needed one. Freya texted me Wednesday night, close to midnight, the same hour Ingrid had called 2 nights before. I'll be there Thursday. Garrett wants me at the reception, says it'll look good, the whole family supporting the business. I said yes before I could think of a reason not to. I don't know yet what that means about what I'm actually going to do when I'm standing in that room. I'm scared, Dad. Not of him finding out what I've been doing, of finding out I still don't know which version of myself shows up when it actually matters. I read the message 3 times before I answered it. You don't have to know that yet, I wrote back. Nobody knows exactly who they'll be in a moment like that until they're standing in it. I didn't know either 3 nights ago, sitting alone in a boat shed with a crate I wasn't supposed to open. What I know is you told me the truth when it would have been easier not to. And you've spent the last week paying attention when it would have been easier to stop. That's not nothing, Freya. Whatever happens Thursday, it isn't nothing. She didn't respond right away. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time, watching the little indicator that showed she was typing, then wasn't, then was again. Before her next message finally came through. I love you. I know I haven't said it right in a long time. I'm saying it now because I don't know what Thursday looks like on the other side, and I didn't want to get there without having said it clearly at least once while I still had the chance to. I love you too, I wrote back. And meant it. More simply than I'd managed to mean it in the 3 days since she'd stood by the salting table and let her husband throw me out into the snow. Soren found me still sitting with the phone in my hand 10 minutes later, staring at nothing in particular. You all right? I don't know yet, I told him, which was as honest an answer as I had. Ask me again after Thursday. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Freya had confessed everything 4 nights before, and poured 2 glasses of the aquavit he kept for occasions he considered worth marking, though he didn't say which category tonight fell into. We drank in silence for a while, the particular silence of 2 old men who'd known each other long enough not to need to fill it. I keep thinking about your grandfather's notebook, Soren said finally. Some things a man keeps in his hands and nowhere else. I wonder if he knew writing that it would end up being the thing that saved the business 3 generations later. He didn't know anything about Garrett. He just understood that some things lose their value the moment you write them down, where anyone can take them. Maybe that's the whole case in the end. Not the trademark, not the fishing violations. Just that the difference between a thing you're given and a thing you're trusted with, Garrett only ever understood the first kind. Soren refilled both glasses. Freya seems to be learning the second kind rather quickly under considerably worse circumstances than anyone should have to learn it. For a while, neither of us said anything at all. Outside, the wind had finally quieted, the first calm night Petersburg had seen in a week. As if the whole town were holding its breath along with the 3 of us, waiting to see what Thursday would actually bring. My phone rang Thursday afternoon, 4 hours before the reception, and the name on the screen stopped me cold before I'd even answered it. Garrett. I was standing in Soren's kitchen at the time, going over the sequence of the evening one final time, with Soren and Ingrid on speakerphone. The 3 of us, picking through every possible way Garrett might try to derail us, before we'd even walked through the door. It was almost funny in hindsight how quickly we found out. He hadn't spoken to me directly since the afternoon he'd stood in the smokehouse doorway and told me to get out. I let it ring twice, steadying myself, motioning for Soren to stay quiet before I answered. Harlan. His voice came through smooth, controlled, the particular calm of a man who's rehearsed exactly how he wants to sound before he dials. I think we should talk before tonight. About the filing you and your lawyer friend put in with the state trademark office yesterday morning. I have a friend who works the front desk over there, small town Harlan. You should know better than anyone how fast word travels. I said nothing, letting the silence do what Soren had told me silence usually does. Pull more out of the other man than a direct question would. I'll be honest with you, Garrett continued when I didn't fill the gap. I don't think you fully understand what you're about to do to this family. If you walk into that reception tonight and try to blow up 2 years of careful business planning in front of investors and international partners, you're not just hurting me. You're hurting Freya. You're hurting your grandson's future. I'd hate to see this get uglier than it needs to. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who still cares about you even after everything that's happened this week. His voice dropped slightly softer, more careful. I've spoken with Dr. Halloran. You remember him? Treated you for that dizzy spell 2 winters back, after Elka's funeral? He's expressed some concerns to Freya informally about your state of mind lately. The stress of losing your wife, then losing the business, now apparently convincing yourself there's some grand conspiracy against you involving trademark filings and shipping companies. A man your age under that kind of strain sometimes doesn't see situations as clearly as he believes he does. I felt something go very cold and very still in my chest, the particular stillness of understanding exactly what a man is threatening before he's finished saying it out loud. I thought briefly of Roald Lindquist's letter in that filing cabinet. A man cornered by his own son-in-law's father decades earlier, trying every angle available to him before finally running out of angles entirely. I wondered whether Garrett understood he was reaching for the exact same desperate maneuver, or whether he believed in whatever way men like him managed to believe things, that he was the first person clever enough to think of it. You're suggesting I'm not competent. I'm suggesting that if you continue down this path, I may have no choice but to raise formal concerns about your capacity to manage your own affairs, for your own protection as much as anyone's. I don't want to do that, Harlan. I respect you too much to want that. But I need you to understand that I'm prepared to if you force my hand tonight. I almost laughed. 40 years spent in boardrooms full of men exactly like him, threatening exactly this kind of desperate, cowardly maneuver when they realized the numbers were no longer in their favor. And here was Garrett, dressing up the oldest trick in the book as some kind of reluctant mercy. Garrett, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I spent 4 decades of my career identifying men who tried exactly this move when they realized they were about to lose. It's always the same shape. Discredit the person holding the evidence before anyone examines the evidence itself. It rarely works on people who've actually looked at what they're holding. This isn't a negotiating tactic, Harlan. I'm genuinely worried. You're genuinely worried I have a notarized certificate of competency? From the Colorado Institute of Cognitive Neurology, sitting in a safe deposit box downtown, obtained 18 months ago, when Elka and I updated our estate planning together, precisely because we both understood men like you exist in this world, and sometimes marry into families they don't deserve to be part of? That wasn't entirely true. Elka and I had gotten the paperwork for tax purposes, nothing more dramatic than that. But it was close enough to true and true enough to make Garrett go quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. You're bluffing. Ask your lawyer to request my medical records before you try that particular maneuver in front of a Judge Garrett. I'll save you the trouble and tell you exactly what he'll find. Nothing. Because there's nothing to find. I let that sit for a moment before I continued. I'll see you at 7 o'clock tonight. I'd suggest you spend the next 4 hours preparing something considerably more useful than threats, because threats are the last resort of a man who already knows he's out of better options. I hung up before he could answer. Soren, standing in the doorway with a garment bag over his shoulder, had clearly heard enough of my side of the conversation to piece together the rest. He knows about the filing, Soren said. He knows. And he's scared enough to reach for the ugliest tool he has left, which tells me everything I needed to know about how much confidence he actually has walking into that hall tonight. You handled that better than I would have. I've had 40 years of practice not flinching when a desperate man tries to make me feel small, right before I take away everything he has left. I set the phone down on the table, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, given what had just happened. Is there actually a competency certificate? Soren asked, one eyebrow raised. Or was that entirely improvised? Elka and I did have our estate paperwork updated 18 months back, and a routine cognitive screening was part of it, standard for anyone restructuring a trust our age. It's not the ironclad legal shield I made it sound like on that call. But it exists, it's on file, and it's enough to make any lawyer Garrett hires think twice before wasting a judge's time on a claim that thin. I allowed myself something close to a smile. Sometimes the truth just needs to be arranged persuasively. Get dressed, Soren, I said. We have a reception attend. By the time I stood in front of the mirror in Soren's guest room 40 minutes later, wearing the charcoal suit and the deep blue tie Elka had chosen decades before either of us could have imagined the occasion it would eventually serve, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, walking into what was essentially a battlefield. Not fear, not even the cold, calculating resolve I'd been carrying for 6 days straight. Something closer to readiness. The particular readiness of a man who has spent his whole life being underestimated by people who mistook his patience for weakness, standing finally at the one moment where that patience was about to become the most dangerous thing in the room. I straightened the tie one final time the way Elke used to do for me, before any occasion she considered important enough to require it, and understood, looking at my own reflection, that some part of her had probably known this suit would be needed for exactly this kind of night. Soren drove us downtown in silence, the two of us watching Petersburg's harbor lights slide past the windows until the Sons of Norway Hall came into view ahead of us, every window glowing gold against the early dark. Music and laughter already spilling faintly into the cold evening air. A room full of people who had no idea yet that the ground beneath their celebration had already been quietly pulled away. The Sons of Norway Hall smelled like cardamom and cedar. The particular warmth of a room decorated for a celebration that hadn't happened yet. Long tables draped in white linen lined the walls, each one set with trays of smoked salmon canapes. My recipe, I noted grimly, prepared by caterers who had no idea whose hands had actually built the process being served on their silver trays. A banner hung above the small stage at the far end of the room. Lindqvist Heritage Products, in gold lettering large enough to be read from the street. Somewhere near the back, a three-piece band played something meant to evoke old-world charm. Fiddle and accordion, weaving through conversation that hadn't yet noticed how much was about to change beneath it. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, the way a man does before stepping onto ice he isn't entirely certain will hold his weight, and let Soren's steady presence beside me settle whatever remained of my nerves. 6 days had brought me to this exact threshold, and now that I was standing on it, the whole ordeal felt smaller and larger at once. Smaller because it came down in the end to one room and one evening. Larger because everything that mattered to me was about to be decided inside the next hour. Garrett stood near the stage in a charcoal suit not unlike my own, shaking hands with a cluster of men I didn't recognize. His laugh carrying across the room in that particular register men use when they're performing confidence rather than feeling it. Freya stood a few feet away from him in a pale blue dress, her eyes finding mine the instant Soren and I stepped through the door. I held her gaze for exactly as long as it took to communicate everything that needed communicating. Not yet. Wait. She gave the smallest possible nod and looked away. Kenji Tanaka was easy to identify. A compact, precise man in his 50s, standing slightly apart from the rest of the crowd, studying the room the way a man studies an investment before committing to it. 2 associates flanked him, both younger, both carrying the particular stillness of people whose job was to watch rather than speak. Ingrid arrived 11 minutes after us, exactly as planned, slipping in through the side entrance, with her press credentials tucked into her coat pocket rather than displayed, indistinguishable from any other guest until the moment she chose not to be. Garrett spotted me across the room, somewhere around the 15-minute mark. I watched the performance of confidence flicker just slightly before he recovered it and made his way toward us with a glass of champagne in each hand, offering one to me like a man extending an olive branch he fully expected to be refused. "Harlan, glad you could make it." His voice carried for the benefit of the small cluster of guests nearby. "I know things have been tense between us. I hope tonight can be a fresh start." "I'm sure you do," I said, taking the champagne without drinking it. "Where's your presentation, Garrett? I understand there's a process you intend to demonstrate for Mr. Tanaka tonight." Something flickered behind his eyes, surprise quickly masked that I knew the buyer's name at all. "There'll be a formal presentation shortly. I didn't realize you were familiar with the specifics of tonight's business." "I'm familiar with quite a lot, Garrett. That's rather the problem for you, isn't it?" He studied my face for a moment, searching for the bluff he clearly hoped was there, and I watched him fail to find it. Whatever confidence the champagne and the borrowed smile had been holding together for the past 15 minutes cracked just slightly at the edges enough that I could see the exhausted, frightened man underneath it. The same man who'd called me that afternoon with threats he already knew wouldn't work if I actually stood my ground. He opened his mouth to respond, but the master of ceremonies chose that exact moment to step up to the small stage microphone, tapping it twice for attention, and the room's chatter gradually quieted into something resembling anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Lindquist Heritage Products, thank you for joining us this evening for what promises to be an exciting announcement in Petersburg's fishing heritage industry. Garrett moved toward the stage, straightening his jacket, and I felt Soren's hand rest briefly on my shoulder. Not stopping me, just steadying, the way a man does for a friend about to step into water colder than either of them fully anticipated. Garrett took the microphone with practiced ease, thanking the room for coming, gesturing toward Tanaka with the particular warmth of a salesman closing in on the moment he's been building toward for years. Tonight, I'm honored to announce a partnership between Lindquist Maritime Holdings and Nakamura Distribution Group, bringing an authentic slice of Alaskan heritage to markets across the Pacific. He gestured toward a screen behind him, and I understood, watching him reach for a remote control, that this was the moment. The recording. 11 months in the making, about to play for a room full of investors who had no idea what they were actually witnessing. I stepped forward before he could press the button. Before you continue, Garrett, I think this room deserves to know exactly what they're being sold tonight. The room's polite murmur died instantly. Every head turned. Garrett's hand froze over the remote, his eyes finding mine, with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the calculated calm from the phone call that afternoon, but something closer to genuine fear. Harlan, this isn't the time to— It's precisely the time, actually. Soren stepped up beside me, opening the leather folder he'd been carrying since we walked in, holding it up for the room to see without yet handing it over. My name is Soren Oss. I'm an attorney representing Harlan Odegaard. Yesterday morning, the state of Alaska provisionally accepted a formal trade secret and trademark opposition against Lindquist Maritime Holdings, specifically regarding the smoking process Mr. Lindquist is about to demonstrate on that screen. A ripple moved through the crowd. Tanaka's expression, I noted with some satisfaction, had shifted from polite interest to something considerably sharper. One of his associates leaned in close to murmur something in his ear, and Tanaka gave a single, small nod without taking his eyes off Soren's folder. The particular attentiveness of a man recalculating an entire evening's worth of assumptions in real time. That's a baseless filing, Garrett said too quickly, his voice climbing half a register. A disgruntled family dispute, nothing more. My father-in-law has been struggling since my wife's mother passed away, and unfortunately, the filing includes a family notebook dating to 1941. Soren continued unmoved, documenting continuous guarded use of this exact process across 4 generations, including handwriting samples from Harlan's grandfather, his father, Harlan himself, and, he paused deliberately, your own wife, Freya, dated to when she was 16 years old, years before you ever registered a trademark claiming sole ownership. Every eye in the room swung toward Freya. She stood very still, her chin lifted, meeting the attention without flinching, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, watching her hold that ground instead of shrinking from it. That's not— Garrett started, then stopped, visibly recalculating. There's more, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall. That recording you're about to play from Mr. Tanaka, I'd like everyone here to understand exactly how it was obtained. 11 months ago, you stood in my smokehouse doorway while I taught your 4-year-old son to stir a brine mixture, and instead of watching your child, you secretly filmed my hands demonstrating a process this family has never once shared outside blood relation. You used a moment of trust between a grandfather and his grandson to steal something you had no legal right to sell. The color drained from Garrett's face in a way I hadn't quite anticipated, faster and more total than I'd expected, and for the first time all evening he had absolutely nothing to say. For a long moment nobody in that room said anything at all. The three-piece band had stopped playing somewhere in the middle of Soren's second sentence, though I hadn't noticed exactly when. The silver trays of salmon sat untouched along the walls. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass tipped and shattered against the floor, and even that sound seemed to arrive from very far away, swallowed by the particular thickness of 100 people holding their breath at once. The gold letters on the banner above the stage caught the light strangely in the stillness, Linkfist Heritage products glinting like something already being taken down. Somewhere behind me, a woman's heel scraped once against the hardwood floor and stopped as though even that small movement had suddenly become too loud for the room to bear. The cardamom smell from the catering tables felt heavier now, cloying, mixed with the cold draft still finding its way in from the propped side door. Freya moved first. She crossed the room slowly, deliberately, past clusters of investors who stepped aside without quite meaning to, until she was standing directly in front of her husband. Garrett looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the one person he still believes might throw him a line. "Freya, tell them," he said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Tell them you knew about the notebook. Tell them this was always meant to protect the family business, that your father is confused that he's been struggling since." "Don't." The single word came out of her low and absolutely steady, cutting through his sentence like a blade through something already thin. "Don't you dare try to use me to finish this lie, Garrett. Not after everything else you've already used me for." His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time all evening, I watched Garrett Lindqvist understand fully, and finally, that there was no version of this room he was going to talk his way back out of. "You filmed my father teaching our son to cook," Freya continued, her voice rising now, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "You forged documents. You've been lying to me for 2 years while I sat across the dinner table from you every single night, believing we were building something together. And tonight, you were about to stand on that stage and sell my family's entire legacy to a stranger using a recording you stole from a 4-year-old's birthday memory, and you thought what you— Exactly. That I'd stand here and back you up. Freya, I'm done, Garrett. I'm done covering for you, defending you, wondering what I did to deserve a husband who'd do something like this to my own father. I'm done." He reached for her arm, and she stepped back out of reach. The movement so quick and final that a small sound moved through the crowd. The collective intake of breath from people watching a marriage end in real time. Garrett's hand hung in the air a moment before he let it drop. "Everything I did for us," he said, quieter now, the performance gone entirely from his voice. "For our family. For Nils's future." "You did it for yourself," Freya said. "You just needed a story good enough that I'd never ask too many questions. And it worked for 2 years because I let it work. That's on me. But it's over now, and it's over because of what you did, not because of anything my father did to you." Tanaka's associates were already speaking quietly to each other in Japanese, one of them typing something into a phone. Tanaka himself hadn't moved, watching the unfolding scene with the particular stillness of a man calculating exactly how quickly he needed to distance himself and his company from whatever this had become. Ingrid chose that moment to step forward, holding up her phone. Not recording anything, simply making her presence and her purpose unmistakable to the room. Ingrid Voss, Petersburg pilot. For those of you who haven't already guessed, Mr. Lindqvist's fishing operation has also been the subject of a 4-month investigation into illegal catch reporting and unlicensed harvesting outside permitted zones using a vessel registered to a joint holding company designed specifically to obscure ownership. That story publishes within the hour, alongside documentation of a default notice on his business loans filed 3 weeks ago. I'd encourage anyone here considering a partnership with Lindqvist Maritime Holdings to read it carefully before signing anything tonight. The room had gone past silence into something closer to a held breath, waiting to see what would break it. What broke it was the sound of the heavy front doors opening. 2 Alaska wildlife troopers walked in, unhurried, scanning the room with the calm of officers who already knew exactly who they were looking for. Behind them, a 3rd officer spoke quietly into a radio clipped to her shoulder. The room held its breath. Silverware sat untouched on linen. Someone near the back reached up and switched off half the overhead fixtures, unsure what else to do with their hands. "Garrett Lindquist?" the lead trooper asked, though it wasn't really a question. He already knew. Garrett didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face had answered for him the moment the doors opened. "We need you to come with us. We have some questions regarding vessel activity logs and catch reporting for the Kestrel Dawn. And I understand there may also be some financial documentation we'll need to discuss." Two investors near the front of the room quietly gathered their coats and left without a word to anyone. The particular exit of people who understood exactly how quickly proximity to a scandal could become its own liability. Tanaka and his associates followed shortly after. Tanaka, pausing only long enough to give Soren a small formal bow, an acknowledgement I understood not of the deal that had just collapsed, but of the thoroughness with which it had been dismantled. Garrett looked at Freya one last time as the troopers led him toward the door. Something desperate and pleading in his expression, searching her face for even a trace of the woman who might still choose him over all of this. She didn't look away, but she didn't reach for him either. The doors closed behind him, and the room exhaled all at once, 100 conversations, starting up in low, urgent whispers, though none of it seemed to reach me clearly. I was watching Freya instead, standing alone now in the middle of the emptying hall, her pale blue dress suddenly looking too bright for a room that had just watched her entire life come apart in front of strangers. She walked toward me slowly, reached into the small clutch purse she'd carried all evening, and pulled out the notebook. My grandfather's notebook, the one Soren had shown the room minutes earlier. Somehow already back in her possession, without my noticing when she'd taken it from him. She held it out to me without a word. I took it from her, and my hands, steady through 6 days of forged confidence and careful deception, were not steady now. I felt them shake once, holding the weight of 4 generations of my family's handwriting, standing in a hall that still smelled faintly of cardamom and cedar, and the particular wreckage of everything Garrett Lindquist had spent 2 years trying to take from us. I had not let my hands shake in front of Soren, not on the phone with Garrett that afternoon, not anywhere else this week where shaking might have cost me something. There was nothing left to protect now, and so my body finally allowed itself the one thing I hadn't given it permission for all week. Freya watched my hand shake and said nothing about it. She didn't reach for me, didn't offer comfort that would have meant explaining what she was seeing. She simply stood there, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and let the silence between us hold whatever neither of us yet had words for. Somewhere across the emptying hall, I heard Soren's voice low and steady, already fielding a question from one of the remaining guests, and Ingrid's voice beside him, calm and clipped, dictating something into her phone before the details could slip away. Neither of them looked toward us, giving Freya and me exactly as much of this moment as we needed, and not 1 second more. 6 weeks passed before Petersburg's snow finally gave up its hold. On the harbor, the ice along the pilings breaking apart in slow gray chunks that drifted out with the tide each morning, until one day, without any particular ceremony, the water ran clear. I learned most of what happened to Garrett secondhand through Soren, who'd taken to updating me over coffee every Tuesday like a man delivering scores from a game he assumed I still wanted to follow. The wildlife troopers' investigation had widened faster than any of us expected, pulling in state fisheries enforcement and eventually the U.S. Attorney's Office once the joint holding structure with the Wrangell shipping outfit revealed a pattern of catch misreporting that extended well beyond the 4 nights Ingrid had originally tracked. Garrett was facing charges on unlicensed harvesting, falsified catch logs, and wire fraud tied to the escrow-style shell company he'd used to obscure the loan against the smokehouse. His attorney, according to Soren, was already floating the phrase financial distress as a mitigating circumstance, though nobody in Petersburg seemed inclined to feel particularly sorry for him. The boats were gone. Seized as part of the ongoing investigation, then auctioned off to cover a fraction of what he owed both the bank and the fraud restitution fund the prosecutors were assembling for his defrauded clients. The trademark opposition Soren had filed cleared its final review 3 weeks after the reception, restoring the Odegaard name to every document, every license, every piece of signage the business would ever need again. Ingrid's story ran the morning after the party, picked up within days by two larger papers out of Anchorage. And I understood from the tone of her most recent call that she considered the whole affair, professionally speaking, the best work of her career so far. Freya moved into a small rental 2 streets over from Soren's house, close enough that Nils could still walk to the smokehouse most afternoons after school, though I noticed she'd stopped calling it that in front of him. She called it Grandpa's shop now. Careful, deliberate, the way a person rebuilds a vocabulary around a wound that hasn't finished healing. She'd asked the week after the reception whether she could come back to work at the smokehouse. Not as an owner. Not even at first as family exactly. She'd asked to start the way any new hire would, learning the process from the bottom the same way I had, as a boy, the same way my own father had. Earning her way back into something, rather than assuming it would simply be handed to her because of blood. I'd agreed, though, not without making the terms clear. "You'll start on brine mixing," I told her standing in the smokehouse doorway on her first morning back, watching her tie an apron around her waist with hands that hadn't done real work in years. "Same as everyone starts. No shortcuts, because you're my daughter." I wasn't expecting shortcuts. Good, because there won't be any. It'll take you a season, maybe 2, before I trust you with the full process again. Not because I don't love you, because trust isn't the same thing as love, and I spent most of my life treating them like they were interchangeable. I'm done making that mistake. She'd nodded, not arguing, and picked up the salt the way I showed her, testing the grain between her fingers, the way I'd taught Nils to do a year earlier, in the photograph that had started all of this. Some mornings I watched her work, and saw only the 16-year-old girl, whose handwriting had turned up in my grandfather's notebook, careful and earnest, wanting badly to get it right. Other mornings I saw the woman who'd sat across from me at Soren's kitchen table, admitting she'd closed a folder rather than face what her marriage had actually become. Both of those people were still in the room with me most days. I'd stopped expecting that to change, and had started slowly to make peace with the fact that it might not. Nils came by most afternoons after school, same as before, though the visits felt different now. Quieter, more deliberate on Freya's part. She stayed close to him in the smokehouse in a way she hadn't bothered to before, watching him watch me, the way I used to let him wander freely between the salting table and the smoker, unsupervised, trusting. I understood why. Trust, once it had been used against a family this badly, didn't come back all at once, even for a 4-year-old stirring brine with his grandfather. It came back in small, measured doses, tested against every new circumstance, before it was allowed to relax again. The building itself had changed too, in the 6 weeks since the reception. Garrett's investor banner had come down the morning after his arrest, and in its place, at Soren's suggestion, I'd hung something considerably smaller and less gold. A modest sign, hand-painted by a local artist who did most of the harbor's storefront lettering, reading simply, Odegaard Smokehouse EST 1941. With my grandfather's initials worked into the corner, the way he used to sign his own paperwork. I'd also done something I hadn't fully explained to Freya yet, though I intended to before the season properly started. I'd been in contact with the vocational program at the high school, the one that had lost its shop class funding 2 years back, about bringing a handful of students through the smokehouse each spring to learn the basics of the trade. Not the full process, not yet, but enough to understand that a business like this one didn't have to disappear the way so many small operations in this town already had. The program director, a tired, earnest woman named Patricia, who'd been trying to keep vocational education alive in Petersburg for the better part of a decade, had nearly wept with gratitude when I called. "Nobody wants to teach kids a trade anymore," she'd told me. "Everybody wants to send them to college for something that doesn't exist yet." I hadn't fully appreciated until that conversation how much my own small act of stubbornness might matter to people who had nothing to do with my family at all. Some of what I'd built would go to Freya, eventually, once she'd earned it the slow way. Some of it I'd decided belonged to whoever in this next generation was willing to show up and do the work, whether or not they shared my blood. Elke would have approved of that, I thought. She'd always said the smokehouse belonged to whoever loved it enough to lose sleep over it, and lately I'd started to believe that circle might need to be wider than just the family name on the deed. That evening, after Freya had gone home and the smokehouse had gone quiet except for the low hum of the smoker doing its slow work in the back room, I did what I'd been doing every night since the reception. I walked the length of the building, checking the front door, then the back, then the front again, testing the deadbolt with my hand, even after I'd already heard it click. I knew rationally that the danger had passed. Garrett was awaiting trial in a facility 300 miles away. The trademark was restored. The notebook was locked in a safe deposit box downtown, not sitting in a filing cabinet anyone could simply walk up to and open. None of that seemed to matter to whatever part of me now checked the locks twice every night before I'd allow myself to leave. Some doors, once you've learned they can open on you when you least expect it, never quite stop needing to be checked. I didn't fight the habit anymore. I simply let it be what it was. A small, permanent adjustment, the kind every survivor carries forward whether they choose to or not. Soren had noticed it once, weeks back, and asked gently whether I thought I'd ever stop. I told him I didn't know, and that I'd decided it didn't much matter either way, as long as the checking itself had become quiet enough not to run my life the way fear once had. I stood outside in the cool spring evening a moment longer watching the harbor lights come up one by one against the darkening water, and thought, not for the first time, about a heavy black crate sitting by the smokehouse door 6 weeks ago, and how close I'd come to never opening it at all, to simply hauling it out to the truck, the way I'd hauled it everywhere else that winter. Never once checking what my own hands were actually carrying until the night curiosity or grief, or something neither of those words quite covered, made me pull the cords loose and look inside. I still keep a small dish of salt on the windowsill above my kitchen sink, the way my grandfather did, the way my father did after him. Every morning I touch 2 fingers to it, before I've had my coffee, an old habit older than I am, tasting nothing, just checking the way a man checks a lock he already knows is closed. For most of my life I believed that love only counted if you gave it away completely, that a father who kept anything back for himself wasn't really a father at all. I built a business, a home, an entire family around that belief, and it nearly cost me every one of them. What I understand now, standing in a smokehouse that finally carries my name again, is that giving everything away and trusting someone with everything are not the same act. One is generosity. The other has to be earned. Slowly, the way brine earns its way into a fillet, a little at a time, tested, never rushed, never assumed. I don't regret the years I spent believing otherwise. I only wish I'd learned the difference before it cost me as much as it did. I think about the people who raised me most on quiet mornings like this one. I think about the God my grandfather prayed to before every season's first batch, the same prayers my father said, the same ones I still find myself saying without quite deciding to, asking for nothing more than steady hands and a family worth the work of keeping. I don't know if God balances anyone's ledgers the way I once balanced corporate ones. I know only that some kind of grace got me through that winter. The same grace I try to thank quietly every morning I still wake up able to do this work, and I've stopped needing to name it more precisely than that. If someone you sacrificed everything for tried to take the rest of what you had left, would you have the strength to open the crate anyway, knowing what you might find inside? God willing, none of you will ever have to find out the way I did. I'd love to hear what you'd do in the comments below. If this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. There are more like it here, waiting to be told.